Okay.
Good evening and welcome everyone to this, the 10th webinar in the Sephardic Mizrahi Jewish Speakers series. Hope all of you had a great time celebrating Hanukkah with family and friends in December. We also wish you all a very happy, peaceful, safe, and healthy 2023. We are extremely appreciative of the 9 organizations supporting this series. They are Congregation BINA, a community of Jews from India, Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, Bet Raim Synagogue, Lodzer Center Congregation, Kulanu Canada, Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, Jews Against Anti-Semitism Canada, the United Grassroots Movement, and the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation. We are thrilled to announce that Bet Tikva Synagogue in Toronto has agreed to become the 11th supporter of the Sephardic Mizrahi Jewish Speakers series, and their logo will be added to all future flyers. Welcome and thank you, Bet Tikva. Alan Herman of CIJR and I worked together on securing speakers and making all the arrangements for these presentations, which we could not possibly do all on our own. Our thanks go to Rajivan Veerasingham of Congregation BINA for his invaluable technical assistance in getting this webinar to you all. Thanks also to Aviva Rubin of Congregation BINA for designing the flyer for us. This evening's presentation is being recorded and will be available to all who registered in a few days after tonight. Please check your junk or spam folder as this email will be sent to you from Congregation BINA. Please make sure you enter all your questions in the chat, and following the presentation, we will proceed with the Q&A session. This evening, it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Neil Reckman, who came highly recommended as the best speaker on the Jews of Barbados. Neil is an American writer and historian who has lived in Barbados for 6 years. He is the author of 2 novels, numerous essays and short stories, and has written and lectured extensively about Louis Brandeis, a 20th century US Supreme Court justice. He speaks very passionately about Brandeis. He holds a degree in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies from Brandeis University and is a volunteer docent today at the historic Nidchei Yisrael Synagogue in Bridgetown, Barbados. His most recent novel, The Ashwanda Rules, published in 2019, is about a secret Israeli Mossad operation in Washington, D.C. that works to save the Jewish Chief Justice from assassination at the hands of domestic terrorists. Domestic terrorists. His current nonfiction is a short book called Fear of Dying, which documents his wife's relatively stress-free acceptance of a terminal diagnosis of stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Neil is an active member of the tiny 50-person Barbados Jewish community, giving him the distinction of being 2% of the entire Jewish population of the island today. He is also an avid bridge player who competes internationally as a member of the Barbados National Bridge Team. Welcome, and over to you, Neil.
Thank you so much, Anne and Alan. Really a privilege to be with you wherever you are. I understand you're all over the world. It's a great privilege for me. As Anne introduced, my name is Neil. I'm a local member of the Jewish community here in Barbados. I'm a volunteer tour guide at the synagogue. Usually these tours are done in person. People are getting off cruise ships or visiting us. Very happy to provide this virtual introduction to the Jewish history of Barbados for all the organizations that Anne mentioned, this very clever coalition of Canadian organizations. And thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm happy now to start my tour of Barbados. Let me, I need to screen share at this point. And I'm now screen sharing. It's going to give me a moment. I'll get my slideshow started. And I'm hoping that everybody can follow along now. This is primarily going to be a history tour. The primary dimension of that we're covering will be history, but I need to get you settled on the location. You need to have a geographic understanding of where we are. So this is a modern Google map of the Caribbean. Barbados is located here. Notice that this is the easternmost of all the Caribbean islands. And I'm going to move down to this map, which shows the entire Atlantic basin. In the 17th century, when there were sailing ships, Barbados was actually on the path from South America back to Europe. So ships that were visiting, coming from Europe to go to South America would stop in Barbados. This was on the supply lines. And this became a strategic location throughout the sailing ship era of the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. Now I'm going to zoom in to our specific location. This is the island of Barbados. This is the main Bridgetown here. This is the main commercial center on the island, and it's the seat of government. And it's where the old Ninche Israel synagogue is located. I'll zoom down a little further now. The entire island here, just so you have an idea, is 166 square miles. The full-time population is about 250,000 people, and it's an independent republic. Has a seat in the UN. So now this is downtown Bridgetown. This is the heart of the commercial center, and you'll see the Ninche Israel Synagogue and Museum is right here. This is among the oldest areas of Bridgetown. Up until the end of the 19th century, this street that you see here called Swan Street. So everybody in the 17th and 18th century called this Jew Street. Not in a pejorative way. There was nothing anti-Semitic about it. This is just where the Jews lived. Today, as Anne pointed out, the community is very different. We're now down to 50 people. As she said, I'm 2% of the congregation, 2% of the community here. We have a small congregation that's affiliated with the conservative movement in the U.S. in North America. There's no full-time rabbi in Barbados with our community. Chabad has a rabbi here, but in our community, there's no full-time rabbi. There's no va'ad, there's no hashgacha. Services are led by members of the community, either in the old restored synagogue, which is downtown here, or in a small air-conditioned house that we converted into a synagogue that's up in this area in Christchurch, of all places. It's another area of Barbados. The Jews in Barbados today, we live all over the island. There's no Jewish area. It's all over the place. The Jewish community here does not own this synagogue. This is part of actually owned by the Barbados National Trust, which is the organization that owns all the historic properties in Barbados. So if, God forbid, the Jewish community here ever disappears, at least this history and the legacy of the Jewish community will be preserved. So now I'm going to take you into the compound. If you were here touring, if you got off a cruise ship or you're visiting us here in Barbados, this would be the entrance that you would see to the old Jewish quarter in Barbados. This is a little video. It's handheld, so it's a little bit herky jerky, but you get the idea. pay close attention to this wall back here and the walls that surround this compound. I'm gonna talk to you a little bit later about that. That's the museum. This is the mikveh. I'm gonna walk you briefly into the synagogue building. And then after we've gone into the synagogue building, we're gonna start our history tour here. Again, if you were visiting us in person, this is exactly what you would see. This is how you would see it. I'm going to be telling you more about this restored synagogue building later in the tour. I just wanted to give you a first impression of it. Okay, now, I mentioned earlier the walls. This is a map, the walls of the Jewish compound. So this is an interesting historical document. This is a map from 1664. This is a surveyor's map. And the walls that you saw in the video, and they go all around here, this compound, here you can read upside down. This is marked as the Jews' synagogue. In the archaic spelling, it's J-E-W-E-S. So this is the Jewish quarter in Bridgetown, and we think at least 1664, probably here a little earlier. This map is from 1664. It's appropriate now just to get into the time frame in history. So if you're Jewish in 1664, let's get an orientation as to where we are, who we are. So Ashkenazi Jews, if you're like my ancestors, Ashkenazi Jews in the 17th century are living in the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe, in Poland and in Russia. These are legally restricted areas. Most of these people are dirt poor. It's not a very pretty existence in the Pale of Settlement in the 17th century. This is the life of Ashkenazi Jews. Sephardi Jews have things a little differently. Sephardi Jews have been expelled from Spain in 1492. Most of them go into the Mediterranean basin, into the Ottoman lands, but many go into a few cities in Europe where Jews are welcome. One of those cities is Amsterdam. But in all cities in Europe where Jews live, for the most part, they're kept penned up in ghettos. Some of you may know that the word ghetto today is a modern word. It means any kind of urban slum. Some of you may know that the origin of the word actually relates to the Jewish ghetto in Venice from the 16th century. The Jews in Venice were penned up in an area of Venice that had been a former foundry. Ghetto is the old Italian word for foundry. So the first ghetto in Venice was a pattern that was established throughout Europe. And most Jews living in Europe, Sephardic Jews living in Europe in the 17th century, had to live in these ghettos. They could go out during the day and conduct business, but at night they were penned up. There were guards that watched over the walls of the Jewish ghettos. The guards were paid by the Jews, and this prevented the Jews from going out at night and committing their nefarious Jewish deeds. Here in Barbados, what is really amazing is that Jews were not, the ghetto here was not, the Jewish quarter here was not a ghetto. They did not have to stay inside the Jewish quarter. In fact, only two people lived in the Jewish quarter, the rabbi and the chazan. Jews were living throughout the island, and they could even go out at night. They roamed around at night. So this was a big deal in the 17th century. It was very unusual for Jews to have this kind of freedom. This is all courtesy of Oliver Cromwell. This is the personal intervention of Oliver Cromwell, and that's the beginning of the history story that we're going to cover now. Okay, so this is a timeline for Barbados. We're just focusing on the top few years in the beginning, so I'm gonna leave it here for now. This is a blow up. I'm gonna leave the timeline here for a couple of minutes just to narrate what's going on, and then we'll get back to the images. So 1627, Barbados is claimed by the British. So there's no indigenous population here. There are no Aborigines. So when the British claimed the island in 1627, this This is the beginning of history. It's important to know who these British settlers were, what their makeup was, and what their motivations were. So the original settlers here in 1627 are actually English aristocrats. These are the sons and daughters of English dukes and earls and lords that have lent money to the English crown, to Charles I or James I. And they've been repaid with land in the New World. This is not how they were expecting to be repaid. This is not how they wanted to be repaid, but that's how they got repaid. So they made the best of it, and they came to Barbados in 1627. These people are aristocrats, though they know nothing about work. And the only way you can make a living in the New World is to do physical work. So these people bring with them their Irish indentured servants by the thousands of Irish indentured servants. These are young Irish Catholics that have been kidnapped, literally kidnapped, by Oliver Cromwell's Army of the Parliament, and one of its sweeps through Ireland. After the Army of the Parliament was done, the Protestants in England issued a bounty on young Irish children. So bounty hunters went into Ireland and captured young Irish boys for £7 a head, girls for £7 a head, boys for £10 a head. And if it was a priest, you would get $20 if you captured a priest. All these people were shipped to Barbados as indentured servants. In effect, these were slaves. This is before the era of African slaves in Barbados. This is not the period when you have Black Africans here. So when the British settled the island in 1627, it's these British aristocrats and their Irish indentured servants. Oliver Cromwell was tolerant of Protestant sects and the Jews, but he viewed Catholics as barbarians. And so even up until the end of the 17th century, Barbados actually became a verb. To be barbadoed was to be kidnapped and shipped to Barbados to work in the sugar and cotton plantations. And this practice only ended after about 20 or 30 years. So that's 1627. This is the makeup of the population of Barbados when they first arrived. Jewish history starts in Barbados in 1654. This is only 27 years later. It's very early on. And this is actually how it happens. Stick with this. This is amazing. One morning in February, in 1654, three big three-masted sailing ships pull out of the mist in Bridgetown Harbor. And these ships discharged 285 black-coated Orthodox Sephardic Jews. These people are speaking Spanish and Portuguese. When they talk among themselves, they're speaking Ladino, which is a language that nobody in Barbados has ever heard before. So think about this from the point of view of these local English aristocrats and their Irish indentured servants. If a spaceship had landed in Barbados and little green men had gotten off, the reaction may not have been that very different. This was an unbelievable occurrence for the settlers living in Barbados to have these three ships of Jews arrive. Who were these people? What did they want with Barbados? And the big question is, why won't they take off their coats in the middle of the tropics? It's really an amazing thing. So the arrival of the Jews in 1654 presents two very big historical questions, and we're going to focus on those questions now. The first question is, why are there three boatloads of Jews floating around the Atlantic in 1654? That's strange enough on its own. The second question is, if there were such ships, why would they call on a British colony? Many of you may know from your British history that Jews have been expelled from England in the year 1290, the famous Edict of Expulsion. Everybody knows this. Jews certainly know this. So why would Jews who happen to be floating around the Atlantic Ocean call on a colony where they know they're not welcome? So these are the two big questions. And we'll address the first one first. Why are there three boatloads of Jews floating around the Atlantic Ocean in 1654? The answer is, there actually are not just three ships. There are 44 such ships. These ships have been sent by the Dutch West India Company. This is a commercial venture that's run out of Amsterdam. They've been sent by the Dutch West India Company to Brazil to rescue the Jews of Brazil in 1654. So how did there come to be Jews in Brazil? We're going to go back briefly to the Spanish Inquisition in 1492. As I said, Jews leaving Spain went into the Mediterranean. Those that went into the European lands were welcomed primarily in Amsterdam. It's a Protestant country where they were tolerant of Jews. And so in 1630, after 100 years in Amsterdam, the Jews of Amsterdam are invited by the Dutch West India Company. This is the Amazon of the 17th century. The Dutch East and West India Companies are these huge commercial businesses. They dominate global commerce entirely. So the Jews of Amsterdam are invited by the Dutch West India Company to settle in a new trading post in eastern Brazil. This is the settlement is called New Holland. Today, this is the modern city of Recife in eastern Brazil. But by 1640, you had in Recife 2,500 Sephardic Jews from Spain to Amsterdam to Recife who ended up in Brazil, and there they are engaged in the sugar business. They're trading precious dyes and woods and other materials that are from the South American continent. And they constitute almost the entire population of this town. So this is, think about this, this is strange enough. This is like Jerusalem in the middle of the Amazon basin in 1654. So the Jews are doing well in Brazil under Dutch colonial protection. They actually they're granted religious liberty in writing by the Dutch West India Company. That's the protection they're given. There are 3 synagogues in Recife. By 1640, there are, of course, the 2 synagogues that everybody goes to and the one that nobody goes to. But in 1654, the Jews of Recife get bad news. The Portuguese have reconquered this area of Brazil. As you know, in Brazil today, they speak Portuguese. They don't speak Dutch. There's a reason for this. And the Portuguese in 1654 still have an active inquisition. So the Jews that are living in New Holland and are forced out by the Portuguese, they're given 6 months to leave. So the Dutch West India Company sends 44 ships over a period of about 9 months to Recife to rescue the Jews of Brazil. Most of these ships go back to Amsterdam. 5 of these ships leaving Recife make their way to a city that was called New Amsterdam. I know most of you are Canadian, but for those of you who know your early North American history, New Amsterdam is now New York City. And this is the beginning of the Jewish presence in colonial North America. So today in New York City at 75th Street and Central Park West, you have the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. This congregation was founded by Jews from Recife, Brazil, who arrived in 1654 when New York was then New Amsterdam, and it was under the control of Peter Minuet. The 3 ships that stopped in Barbados were fleeing Brazil. The reason they stopped, now we're getting to the question of why would these ships stop in a British colony? So the British ships, the 3 ships that stopped in Barbados, the head of that particular expedition, a man named Abraham de Mercado. This man was the president of one of the synagogues in Brazil. Abraham de Mercado had in his possession a letter personally dictated by Oliver Cromwell. This is the Protestant leader of England. This was a letter of safe passage, and I'm gonna read it out. I'm gonna translate it into modern English. It was written in this very archaic English. The letter said, "This authorizes Abraham de Mercado and his Jewish compatriots to practice their Jewish faith in Barbados, and for Abraham to practice medicine. He was a physician." So think about this. This is an absolutely astonishing document for the Jews to be holding. Jews are banned from living. Why would Oliver Cromwell do something like this? He doesn't consult Parliament. He doesn't talk to anybody. He just dictates this letter that allows the Jews into England. He knows what the policy in England is. So what's going on here? The backstory is really fascinating. And I mean, 3 PhDs have been written about this, at least 6 books. We could go on for hours about this part of history. I'm going to give you the very briefest synopsis. This is the nutshell of what's going on. So in 1654, Oliver Cromwell is already doing business with the Jewish bankers in Amsterdam. The bankers in Amsterdam are financing Oliver Cromwell's wars. They're paying his soldiers. Why would the Jews in Amsterdam be supporting Oliver Cromwell? That's because Oliver Cromwell has wars against the Spaniards and the Portuguese. These are the people that have the Inquisition against the Jews. So the Jews in Amsterdam are only too happy to help Oliver Cromwell. They have a common enemy. So by 1654, the Jews in Amsterdam already know who Oliver Cromwell is. He's already doing business with them. The Jews in Amsterdam receive letters from their cousins in Brazil. They've been kicked out by the Portuguese. They need a place to go. The Jewish bankers in Amsterdam whisper in Oliver Cromwell's ear, we need a place for these people to go. These are sugar merchants. They know how to make sugar. If you don't want them to come to a British colony, they'll go to Suriname, or they'll go to Curacao, and they'll raise their sugar there, and they'll grow their sugar in a Dutch colony, and they'll ship their sugar in Dutch ships. If you want the Jews to have all this mercantile influence with the Dutch, go for it. But if you want the Jews to start to help the British commercial mercantile effort, let the Jews into Barbados, or let them into Charleston, South Carolina. So this was the argument that the Jews made. A petition was sent to Oliver Cromwell, and he jots off this letter to Governor Searle of Barbados in 1654. It was in the possession of Abraham de Mercado. This is how the Jews come to Barbados. They set up shop in 1654 at the synagogue that I just showed you. It was not that building, but it was in the same footprint as that building. And the Jews jumpstart the sugar economy in Barbados in 1654. Sugar was already being grown here, but the Jews who arrived from Brazil had with them on their ships an intact working sugar factory. This was a sugar plantation. They had all the trade secrets. Making sugar in the 17th century was not known. How to do this was not known by everybody. You have boilers, you have furnaces, you have metal parts. There are windmills that are used for crushing the sugar cane. All this stuff was packed up on these ships. These people were basically moving a business from one location to another. They had on their ships with them 27 South American slaves who were skilled in the cultivation of sugarcane. So the idea here was they were just moving their business. Instead of moving it to a Dutch colony, they moved it to a British colony. This jump-started the sugar economy in Barbados. Even though they had been growing sugar here before, the Jews brought new technology and improved methods for growing sugar. Barbados rapidly became a very wealthy colony based on its sugar output. And this was primarily the result of the arrival of the Jews from Brazil in 1654. So this is just a brief portrait of Oliver Cromwell. He was a friend of the Jews, and in a sense, back in the time when he admitted them into England. I don't want to give anybody the impression that this friendship was altruistic. There was nothing theological about this friendship. This was strictly business. Oliver Cromwell admitted the Jews first to Barbados in 1654. And then 4 years later, in 1658, because things had gone okay with the Jews in Barbados, Jews were admitted to England proper. This was all the result of Oliver Cromwell's initiatives. You can look up something called the Whitehall Conference from 1655, which was an effort by Oliver Cromwell to gain support for the return of Jews to England among the burghers and the lawyers of London. He didn't get it, so eventually he just authorized it on his own. So this now is a very interesting document. The pass that had been issued by Oliver Cromwell to Abraham de Mercado. The past that was in the hands of Abraham de Mercado has been lost. But there's a book in the British Archive at Kew. You can see that this is page 130. Oops, sorry, gotta go back. Okay, so this is page 135 of a book that's some 280 odd pages long. This original book is in the British Archive at Kew. And this is a list. It's simply an administrative record of all the letters of safe passage that Oliver Cromwell ever issued during his tenure. So you see the list is organized by name. These are the names of the people that have been issued. This is the pass issued to Abraham de Mercado. And here it is blown up. I'm gonna translate this for you out of this archaic English into modern English. It has some very interesting components. So this pass was issued to Abraham de Mercado. You can see that very clearly. This is his will. This is Oliver Cromwell's will, and he requests you to permit and suffer Abraham de Mercado, doctor of medicine. He was a physician. Of this location, I can't make out where he was from. Here you see a caret. Somebody has inserted a caret and written afterwards, a Hebrew by nation. So this is his will. He requests you to permit and suffer from Abraham de Mercado, a Hebrew by nation, with David Raphael de Mercado, his son, to transport themselves to the island of Barbados without any hindrance or molestation, they carrying with them nothing prejudicial to the state. So this is signed by a man named Henry Lawrence. He was the president of Oliver Cromwell's Council of State. This was an administrative body that kept all the legal and administrative records during the Cromwell regime. To my, I'm an amateur historian. To my way of thinking, this is the very first indication, the very first written permission for Jews to settle in England since the Edict of Expulsion in 1290. If anybody in the audience here has any other information where they know of some other indication that Jews have been allowed into England after 1290, I would love to know about it. I think this indication in 1655, this is dated April 27th, 1655. To my way of thinking, this is the first indication that Jews have been allowed back into England after the Edict of Expulsion. Now we're back onto the timeline. This is a painting of downtown Bridgetown taken that was done in 1688. And it's really the only depiction that we have of the original synagogue building that we believe was built in 1654. You can see it with this Moorish style arches here. But this is the only definitive evidence we have of the synagogue other than the records of the community. Now I'm going to take us back to the timeline briefly. 1739, moving ahead to 1739. By 1739, there's another synagogue in Speightstown. Speightstown is a little urban center that's north of Bridgetown, and a group of Jews has settled there. They have a wedding at the Speightstown synagogue, and the newspapers in 1739 report that after the wedding, a party is held and non-Jews are invited to this party. And the rum, this is Barbados, the rum flows at the party and people get drunk. Somebody accuses somebody of something, and this turns into a pogrom. This is the only anti-Semitic riot in Barbados history. The building was burned to the ground. We don't even know today where this synagogue was. And the Jews were chased out of town by torchlight. So that's the end of the synagogue in 1739. Moving ahead on the timeline is 1750. This is now the height of the Sephardic Jewish population in Barbados. There are 800, according to the census, Jews are counted as white people. So there are 800 Jews in the census of 1750. The white population is now down to 12,000. So this makes the Jews about 4% of the population of Barbados, as you know from your own experience. This is a huge demography for Jews in any environment. Jews are 4% of the population of Barbados. I'll move on to this next screen here. Jews in Barbados, there are all kinds of restrictions that have been placed on the Jews. They're doing okay, but Jews cannot make money in the plantation business because they're restricted from owning more than 3 acres of land. For a period of time in the 1600s, Jews were restricted from owning more than 1 slave. There were special taxes that Jews paid. They were just called Jew taxes. That was the label. There was nobody was really trying to hide it in any way. Notwithstanding all these disabilities, the Jews in Barbados, some of them were doing well, not all, but some of them were doing well because they were involved in the sugar harvest. So the Jews would go out to all the plantations at harvest time, and there they would run Dutch windmills that crushed the sugar cane. Every other island in the Caribbean in the 17th century where they're growing sugar, or the 18th century, we're already in the 1750s. In the 18th century, every other island where they grow sugar, they don't use windmills. They use these horizontal wheels that are pushed by cattle and slaves. You might have seen this in the movies. It's a very labor-intensive process to crush the sugar cane. So Jamaica, Puerto Rico, everywhere else they're growing sugar, they use the cattle and slaves. Here in Barbados, the Jews have figured out a way to use Dutch windmills to crush the sugar cane, and they're making a fortune, not because they're producing more sugar, but because they're producing it so much more efficiently than everybody else. By 1750, there are 402 windmills dotting the landscape of Barbados. There's a windmill on every plantation, and every square inch of the island is covered in sugarcane. Crystallized sugar is a currency in Barbados in 1750, and it is throughout the Caribbean. You can buy things. 5 pounds of sugar will buy you this. 10 pounds of sugar will buy you that. Sugar in the 18th century was the equivalent to what petroleum is today in terms of trade and volume of trade. Today you have all these oil tankers roaming around the planet delivering oil. Back in the 18th century, these were spice ships, but primarily sugar ships. And the Jews were at the very heart, the center of this trade. We have buried, you'll see when we get to the cemetery tour, we have buried in the cemetery a man named David Raphael de Mercado, who invented the device that converted a windmill into a sugar factory. And he was among the wealthiest people in the Caribbean, actually in the Western Hemisphere in the 18th century. Hopefully we'll have a chance to get to his tombstone. So now we're in 18, I'm moving us forward now to making good progress here. We're moving along. 1831, a hurricane destroys Barbados, everything in Barbados. 800 structures come down. The synagogue building loses its roof. 20% of the population dies. And the sugar economy already in the 1820s has started to collapse in Barbados. This is because you can now get sugar from beets in Europe. This is like sugar from potatoes. And some of you may know that in the British Empire in 1834, the British outlawed slavery altogether throughout the British Empire. Cane sugar was harvested by slaves. So, and you really can't pay anybody enough to go out into the fields in August and harvest sugar. So that changed the equation, and you couldn't really make money in sugarcane anymore in the 1800s. So Barbados emptied out, and then the hurricane hit. Everybody thought that was going to be the end of Barbados. But in 1834, the Jewish community in Barbados, now down to 50 families. These people had money. They decided they wanted to make a statement, so they rebuilt the building in 1834. This publication here is from the newspaper in 1834. It describes the reconsecration of the synagogue. They spent 5,000 British pounds and brought in two architects to rebuild the building in 1834. That's actually the structure that is here today. By 1851, the last Sephardic Jewish wedding was recorded in Barbados. By 1890, this is the way the interior of the building looked. And the Jewish community had now dwindled to fewer than a dozen people. And then this is the building. In 1922, there were 2 Jews left in Barbados, Edmund and Joseph Baeza. Edmund dies and Joseph sells the building to a law firm. This became a law library in 1931. In 1945, this was an office building in the British colonial administration. As you can see, it looks nothing like a synagogue. It has aluminum and glass windows. There are 2 floors inside. There are internal staircases. It looks nothing like this. This is another view of it. This is in the early 60s. So then in 1985, the government of Barbados is ready to tear down they're ready to tear down the old building. The Jewish community here doesn't own it. And there are now 100 Ashkenazi Jews in Barbados. This is not the original community. The Sephardic community has disappeared. But now in 1985, you have 100 Ashkenazi Jews in Barbados. And these are the grandchildren of Ashkenazi Jews who fled Hitler in the 30s. So we all know our history from the 30s. This is the way it worked. It didn't matter where you went. If somebody would let you in, this is good enough. This is where you go. So in the 30s, there were about a half dozen Jewish families that made their way to Barbados one way or another. And then in 1985, their grandchildren raised their hands, and this is now my opinion. I think they deserve tremendous credit. They raised their hands and they said to the government in Barbados, you don't want to be tearing this building down. This would be the wrong thing to do. So the Ashkenazi Jews in 1985 did not own this building. They had no connection to it. They were praying in somebody's home. They were using the cemetery, and they knew what the history of the building had been. So in 1985, two leading members of the community, these are still men that are alive in our community today. They went to the Barbados Museum. They got photographs of the old interior of the synagogue, like the one I just showed you, and others with showing the rabbis. And they took these photographs to Prime Minister Tom Adams in 1985. And they said to the Prime Minister, if you tear the building down, this is the history that they're taking away with it. You really should pause before you do something like this. So this was successful. An agreement was reached with the government of Barbados in 1985. The Ashkenazi Jewish community here committed to raise $1.5 million to restore this building as a working synagogue and as a tourist attraction for the island. And the government ceded the property here not to the Jewish community. This is owned by the Barbados National Trust. This is the organization that owns all the historic properties in Barbados. So as I said, if we're a very small community, if something ever happens to the community here, at least it will be this will be preserved. So now this is the building as it's restored. This is the north face view. You can see here there's a staircase where the women would get into the mechitza. We'll get a better view on the inside. This is the front of this is the south side view. This is the front entrance. This is the interior. So the building that we're in now this was restored in 1834 after the hurricane, and then restored again in 1987. Everything that you see here is a restoration now. Everything you see here now is a restoration based on the architect's plans from 1834. There are 2 items that I like to point out that are original. One is the clock. This is the clock. This is a working clock. You can see a key underneath it. We had a visit here from Prince Charles in 2019 that when the Prince was here, the clock was wound. It was in perfect time. When the Prince was here, everything was working. So the clock is original from 1834. And the Aseret HaDibrot, these 10 commandments, in 1985, These two marble tablets were found hanging over the swimming pool of the Governor General's house in Barbados. Nobody has any idea why that is or how that came to be, but that's where they were. The chlorine had faded to gold lettering. They were brought back and reinstalled here in the synagogue. So I'm going to go back once more to the ark. Here we go. So this ark is actually a restoration, but it is made from Barbados mahogany. This is a very rare wood. There are only about 300 Barbados mahogany trees left. But the original plans called for Barbados mahogany, the 1834 architect's plans. So in 1987, the government authorized 2 mahogany trees that were already down to be used for this project. This is a very beautiful, special place. Now we're getting to the cemeteries. We're running out of time. I'm going to do a quick tour of the cemeteries here. This quadrant of the cemetery, up until World War II, up until 1945, this area had all been paved over and was part of a car park. So the stones that you see here, whoops, sorry. So the stones that you see here are restorations after asphalt was removed, and recreations were done based on the cemetery directory. This is another part of the cemetery. The oldest stone here is right here. This is from 1662. This stone is from 1665. We have a stone from 1658, but the name, there's a discrepancy about the date and the name on it. So now I'm just going to point out this one very interesting tombstone here. Blink your eyes, pretend you're in 1685. And this is the old Sephardic cemetery here. As you can see, all the other tombstones have this very plain and simple format. It's your name and your date, and it's flat and nothing else. This man died in 1685 and put in this very elaborate triangular geometric tombstone. This was like a neon sign in the cemetery in 1685. This is this tombstone of David Raphael de Mercado. This is the Jeff Bezos of the 17th century. This is the guy that invented the sugarcane windmill, and he was among the, as I said, he was among the wealthiest people in the Caribbean. I think he paid £50 for this tombstone, if I'm not mistaken. This is a close-up of that tombstone. This is the most famous resident we have in here, Barbados. I see we're running out of time. I'm gonna speed it up here. This is actually our most famous resident. Hard to read here. His name is Raphael Chaim Isaac Carigal, C-A-R-I-G-A-L. There you can see it clearly. So Carigal, Raphael Chaim Isaac Carigal, this man has his own Wikipedia page. This is a famous man. You can read about him on your own. But he has his portrait hanging at Yale. This is his portrait hanging at Yale University. I like to tell briefly how he gets his portrait hung at Yale. Hopefully we'll have enough time for this. So this is David Raphael, no, it's not. This is Raphael Chaim Isaac Carigal. He is born in Hebron, in Ottoman Palestine, in 1733. He was trained as a rabbi in Ottoman Palestine, in Hebron, and they sent him out at an early age. By the 1755, they had sent this man out to the wider Jewish world to raise money for the destitute Jews of Palestine. Back in the 18th century, this is a job title, as you may know. This man is called a shaliach, a messenger. But he is very good at this job. He's a very charismatic guy. He's very tall. He speaks 6 languages completely fluently. This man can preach in 6 languages, and he knows to converse in a half dozen others. This man has traveled all over the world in sailing ships. He's as far east as Isfahan, which in the 18th century is the capital of Persia. This man is as far west as Curacao. He takes sailing ships over the Caribbean. He's in Curacao. He spent a decade in Europe, traveling around to the different communities in Europe. He was the highest paid rabbi in London in the 1760s. In 1773, on the holiday of Purim, in 1773, this man, Raphael Chaim Isaac Carrigal, is preaching at the Touro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. This is a famous structure. This is the oldest synagogue structure in colonial North America. It was founded by Jews from Barbados in 1688 when discriminatory laws were passed against Jews in Barbados in 1688. Jews left Barbados and they made their way to Newport. This is the second Jewish community after New York in North America. So on Purim in 1773, Carrigal is preaching at this pulpit, on this pulpit in Spanish at the Touro Synagogue, and there's a non-Jewish man in the audience. This man is a Protestant minister. His name is Ezra Stiles. Ezra Stiles is a Protestant minister, and his flock follows the Old Testament, not the New Testament. So he's very interested in Carrigal because Carrigal speaks Hebrew. He's a rabbi. This is the first man he's ever met that speaks Hebrew or knows Hebrew. So after the sermon, Stiles introduces himself to Carrigal. This is before the age of interfaith dialogue. Rabbis typically don't get involved in conversations with priests. But Carrigal befriends this man. They become friends, and Carrigal agrees to teach Stiles Hebrew. So these two men, it teaches them the alphabet. These two men learn Hebrew, and they start to exchange letters written in this very archaic, like Siddur-like Hebrew, where they talk about their personal lives and the events of the day, just as a way of practicing their Hebrew. These letters still exist, and they become very valuable historical documents. In the meantime, at the end of some of these men and friends for 6 months, Stiles is learning Hebrew furiously from Carrigal. Carrigal is appointed the rabbi in Barbados at the end of 1773. He comes to Barbados. In the same month, December of 1773, Stiles, this man you're looking at now, is appointed president of Yale College. And this is where it all begins. So Stiles' first act as the president of Yale is to make Hebrew language a required course for every student entering Yale. This is not a very popular thing to do in 1773. This is the beginning of what's known as Hebrew Revolution at Yale. This is a period in Yale history. So now you have the American Revolution taking place. Keep your time frame in mind. It's 1776, the American Revolution. There are no public activities at Yale until 1781. In 1781, Stiles, this man, goes out onto the quad in New Haven, out into the public. And he speaks to the Yale community in public for the first time. And he speaks to everyone in Hebrew for half an hour. And then he switches to Aramaic. Nobody has any idea what's going on. Then, in 1783 and in 1785, the valedictorians of Yale College deliver their valedictory addresses in Hebrew. This is all the result of Carrigal, having the rabbi in Barbados, having met this man Stiles at the Touro Synagogue on Purim in 1773. In the meantime, Carrigal, the man on the right, the rabbi, has died at a very early age in Barbados. He's 48 years old. He dies in 1777. Stiles, his good friend, finds out about it. He's devastated. He can't believe his friend has died. He hires a man named Samuel King, who's now a famous portrait artist. This man has painted 3 portraits of George Washington. So he hires Samuel King to paint 2 portraits, one of himself, Stiles, this man is the president of Yale, and another of his friend Carrigal. This portrait is painted from an engraving in the Newport newspaper that was done when Carrigal spoke there in 1773. So these 2 portraits hang together in the Yale Library for 156 years. Stiles, in his last will and testament, requests that his portrait hang together with his friend Carrigal in perpetuity forever in the Yale Library. But in 1927, Stiles' family, through the US courts, they regain control of the Stiles portrait. This is a priceless artwork, and they take it away. So now you just have Stiles hanging in the main foyer of the Sterling Library at Yale. But if you ever want to get your portrait hung at Yale, that's one way to do it. We're close to running out of time. I apologize. This is the mikveh in Barbados. This was discovered by accident in 2007. So remember, this is only 16 years ago. This was discovered by accident. The area in front of the mikveh, this had all been asphalt. It's now this restored brick. But they were digging up the asphalt to install the brick in 2007, and they discovered steps going down in the middle of a parking lot. And that's the serendipity that resulted in the discovery of this mikveh that predates the synagogue building. The understanding is that this mikveh was here probably before the synagogue building was built in the 1650s. The spring water that you see here is natural spring water. It flows. This is a kosher mikveh. The water comes up through the bottom. It dissipates out through the sides. They test this water every year in Barbados. You can drink the water. I love saying this. Nobody knows where the water is coming from, and nobody knows where it's going. The source of this water is unknown. The alcoves here were where candelabras were put. The original community here, they have extensive records about the operation of the mikveh. The original community here was Sephardic, so they referred to this as the banyo. This was not the mikveh. They referred to it as the banyo, and the woman who ran it was the banyadeira. And we're closing in on our hour here. This is just a picture of the synagogue at sunset. This is a really beautiful setting here. When I came to Barbados in 2016, I knew there was a synagogue here. I didn't know it was this synagogue. This is just an astonishing place that's dripping with history. This photograph was taken on Purim in 2019 by the wife of a visiting rabbi. I will give her credit. This is Renee Salomon. It's a beautiful, beautiful photograph showing the courtyard in the moonlight in Barbados. Those of you that are interested in following up on the history and the details, there's a tremendous amount that's been written. You can Google Sephardi Jews of Barbados and find tons of sources. There's a gentleman who grew up in Barbados. His name is Simon Kreindler. Many years ago, he wrote a history of the Ashkenazi Jews here, peddlers all, and very recently, he completed this book about the Sephardi Jews of Barbados. And if you're looking for additional information, I highly recommend this. It's really one of the only storytellings of this era, this period, that's chronological. Most of the other information relates to industry or specific political eras. This is an excellent chronological account of the Sephardi Jews in Barbados. For those of you, this is an I'm doing an advertisement now. For those of you who are interested, we do bar mitzvahs and weddings here in destination bar mitzvahs and weddings here in Barbados. This is our community's website. If you're interested in visiting us, please visit the website, or you can contact us at this email address. Anybody who's seen this presentation, we would welcome donations. There's a donate button. After COVID hit, a big source of revenue for the synagogue here dried up. These were tourists that had been on cruise ships. That's why we created this virtual tour. So for those of you who are able, if you're amenable, an $18 any donation would be welcomed by the Barbados Jewish community. It's all going towards the preservation of the legacy here. If you're interested about me or my books, this is my website here. And I'm happy to entertain questions for anybody who's interested. Should I stop the share now?
Yes, please. Yeah. And we will, thank you. It was an excellent presentation, Neil. Thank you so much. Let's move on to the Q&A. So we'll go straight into the questions. And we've received a number of questions. Let me start with ones that came in earlier. Do you know of any source documents for the arrival of Jews in Barbados from Recife in 1654? Ships' names, passengers, lists, anything?
So I would love that information. I'm on a high horse right now. I'm really in pursuit of source documents that relate to the arrival of Abraham de Mercado in 1654. The answer is I don't have the information for you, but when I come up with it, I'll be happy to share it. I have a feeling that the best source is going to be Martin Bowden. He's an historian that has two books, one about the geography of Bridgetown, another about the early Jewish pioneers here. And I have a feeling that that's going to be the best source. But I'm in the middle of pursuing this. So your questioner can feel free to be in touch with me. If I get the answers, I'm happy. I'd be happy to. We get questions, genealogical questions here all the time.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I'm looking for this the same information.
Okay. How do you know that they were black coated? What is the evidence of this? Someone's asking.
So I did show you one depiction of the Jews. I did show one picture there. So this was just the way these people dressed. There was a Jewish uniform. Among the Sephardic Jews, there was basically a Jewish uniform in the 18th century, and there were no Reform Jews or Conservative Jews or Reconstructionist Jews. Either you were Jewish or you weren't. And if you were Jewish, you wore the uniform. So when I say black coated, maybe it wasn't dark black, maybe it was brown, but these people continued to dress even when they were in Brazil, which is even further south. All the images of these people in Brazil all show them wearing their coats. Imagine what it's like on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in Barbados in September, with the humidity is 90%, and you're sitting in your coats in the shul. This is before the age of air conditioning.
Neil, do you know if the history of Jews in Trinidad and Tobago was similar to that of Barbados?
So I do know that many of the Jews that arrived in Barbados actually they were on ships that were going to Trinidad. Many of the steamships. This is the 20th century. Many of the steamships that were going from Europe to South America stopped in Barbados and Trinidad on their way to Venezuela. Okay. And so the first family that arrived here, the Altmans, they were on their way actually to Trinidad. They got off the boat here and liked it. The immigration restrictions were not nearly, and the controls were not nearly as tight as they are now.
Yeah. Okay.
Nothing.
Someone commented that Queen Elizabeth I had a Portuguese Jewish doctor from Amsterdam. So he was allowed in England at some point.
There were Jews living in England even during the period when Jews were not permitted to live in England. They just couldn't live openly. They couldn't practice their religion. There were merchants. There were Spanish and Portuguese merchants who were in London, and people knew that they were Jewish, but it was all sotto voce. It was all covered up. And Abraham de Mercado, the way he got this pass from Oliver Cromwell is he visited England before he left Brazil. He went to Amsterdam. He stopped in London, picked up the pass, and then went back to Brazil to come with his compatriots to Barbados. So there was Jewish activity in England, but it just wasn't sanctioned. It wasn't official.
And who picked the sugar in the 17th century? Was it slaves?
Yeah. So in the Jews in Brazil, when they were in the sugar business in Brazil, they were using South American slaves, and the English aristocrats here were using Irish slaves. It's really, back in the economics of the day, it was very hard to pay anybody enough. to go out and packet sugarcane. This is a absolutely brutal existence. The only real practical way to get it done was to have whips.
Yeah.
Whips and guns.
Where did all the Sephardic Jews go? You said they all left. Where did they go?
The Sephardic Jews that left Barbados, so most of them go back to, you're talking about the Sephardic Jews that left Barbados or that left Brazil? Barbados. So they started to leave Barbados in the late 18th century when the sugar trade collapsed. Most of these people went back to Amsterdam. A lot went to North America, where Jews by the 19th century, Jews were free to move around North America, and went to Suriname and other Dutch colonies, those that were still involved in the sugar trade.
Okay, so the original Torah scrolls in Barbados were Sephardic.
Yes.
Right. Where did all of those scrolls go? Are they there still today, or have they all been dispersed? So
the Sephardic scrolls and all of their silver ceremonial objects, of which there were many. I mean, this was a huge collection of silver Judaica. And about 8 of the old Sephardic scrolls that have the hard canister containers, those were all shipped to the Bevis Marks Synagogue in downtown London in the late 19th century under a trust agreement.
Oh, okay.
And those artifacts are still there. They can still be seen. The Torah scrolls that we have in Barbados are Ashkenazi scrolls. One is a modern one that was donated here about 20 years ago. Another one was brought by the Burak family when they emigrated in the 1930s. And we also have one of the Czech scrolls. This is one of the scrolls saved from the Nazis in World War II. We have a scroll from Třebíč, which is a town in Czechoslovakia, and we have it on loan for 5 years.
Okay, and it was very interesting to see the tombstones.
Yes,
showed in the cemetery. One of the questions was, you don't usually have a cemetery so close to a synagogue, so that's very unusual. And the tombstones were the kind I know that we have in India too, and I'm wondering if it's a Sephardic tradition that they cover the entire grave. Like it's not just a headstone, it's a complete, tombstone that covers the entire grave. Is that prevalent today in Barbados? Is that the way they still build tombstones in Barbados, or are they moving to just headstones?
No, so as you know, the Ashkenazi community has a different tradition. And so the original Sephardic tombstones really are deteriorating tremendously just based on age. We do what we can to preserve them. There are, I'm guessing, about 24 Ashkenazi graves that have upright stones that are in a more modern tradition. And then the current part of the cemetery, we have 60 new spaces for future burials. An agreement has been made that all of the future stones will all be flat in the Sephardic style.
Okay.
We're gonna go back to the Sephardic style and try to maintain that going forward. Did I answer your question? I feel like I'm forgetting something.
Yeah. No, you've answered it. You've answered it. You showed us the historical document from Cromwell.
Right.
Right. Can you tell us a little more about it? Can you expand a bit on that?
Yeah, so the document that is the record of the past that was issued to Abraham de Mercado, this is just amazing. So many years ago, I think 3 or 4 years ago, I did a tour here at the synagogue in person and told the same story that I just told everybody here about Oliver Cromwell issuing this pass. And a man in the audience raises his hand and he says, "I'm Michael Stewart, and I'm a 10th generation direct descendant of Oliver Cromwell." So he identified himself and he asked me if I could produce this pass that had been given to Abraham de Mercado. And I said, no, I wish I could show it for you. Do you have any idea where I could get it? So he said he would look for it. And he went back, he has connections. He went back to the British Colonial Archive at Kew, and he consulted people. It turns out the original pass that Oliver Cromwell had written was in fact lost, but he located this record, this administrative record, and sent me a microfiche of it.
Okay.
So that's how we come to this document, and I'm really thrilled to have it.
Yes, it is. Yeah, and that's a treasure. What sort of ties exist between the Jews of Barbados and other Jewish communities today? Do they have close ties to Israel or any other community, to the States, to Canada?
So the small community here, we have limited resources, limited capacity. So we focus on three things. We focus on just having our regular Friday night services. We focus on protecting the history of the synagogue and the legacy that's here. And we do everything that we can to support the state of Israel. So that means we take cues from the Israeli ambassador to Barbados. This is a man who sits in Panama, and he represents Israel in the entire Caribbean region. And whenever we have anti-Israel demonstrations or any kind of political activity here that involves Israel, we take cues from the Israeli ambassador. And I have to say, his name is skipping me right now, but he's been very helpful. He's really he's very attentive to the diaspora community in the Caribbean. We don't really have time for much else.
No, I know. But someone commented that the painting of Stiles, Reverend Stiles, includes a copy of the Talmud. What he's holding in his hand apparently is a copy of the Talmud.
Well, this is true. You may know that the logo of Yale also has Hebrew in it. If you get a diploma from Yale, it has Hebrew on it. It says Urim v'Tumim. This is from Leviticus. It relates to the jewels on the Aron Kodesh. Okay. At the time, they thought it meant truth and light. So having Ezra Stiles holding the Talmud is not really a surprise. The whole period of his leadership at Yale is known as the Hebrew Revolution at Yale, and it's a very distinct part of their history. It's written about a lot.
Okay, then one last question. The book, Once We Were Slaves, talks a lot about mixed marriages, out of wedlock relations between Jewish men and slaves, the slave women, or free slave women. Any comment on that?
So we get the general question about Jews and slaves. A lot of people are looking for some signs that Jews did not treat slaves the same way, or that they somehow were not involved in slavery the way it was. And the fact of the matter is, you can cherry pick history for almost anything. If you want to find Jews who were opposed to slavery, you can find that. But in a general sense, Jews were white. They were part of the white community. They were on the very lowest rung of the white world, but they were white. And slavery was part of the commercial fabric of society. It was just what it was. The Jews in Curacao ran the wholesale slave market in the Caribbean. That was their business. They would receive the slave ships directly from Africa. They would buy the slaves for cash and then lease them out to the landholders. So it's hard for Jews to escape any involvement with slaves. But by the same token, they had the same relationships with slaves that other white people did, which is to say that some Jewish men would have two families. They would have a family, and they would have a Jewish family, and then they would have a family outside the walls.
Okay.
And you have in the phone book of Barbados today tons of last names of Black Africans here in Barbados these are Sephardic Jewish last names.
Okay. Well, I have to stop right there. I'm telling you, if you look at all the comments that we have received in the chat, Neil. There's so much praise for your presentation today.
Thank you.
Fantastic
I'm delighted.
presentation, so knowledgeable, so informative, and it goes on and on and on. So
Thank you.
thank you. On behalf of Alan, myself, Congregation BINA, and our 11 supporting organizations, and everyone on the webinar, I wish to say a heartfelt thank you for sharing your knowledge with us this evening. You have enlightened us on the rich history and culture of the Jews of Barbados. I'm sure we have all widened our knowledge of the Jewish community there, of whom personally I knew very little. The PowerPoint slides you shared with us help to bring the community and its history to life. And people on the chat are recommending that anyone who is visiting Barbados should take the tour with Neil. It is well worth it. I want to say to all our registrants today, if any of you have suggestions of other speakers on Sephardic communities that we could contact for future webinars, please send us your suggestions to liaison@congregationbina.ca. And Neil, people want to know for donations, is there a website or something that we could put into the chat for them?
It's jewishbarbados.org.
jewishbarbados.org.
I showed it as the last screen on the presentation. If you want, I can try to put it up again.
Yeah, just put it up again. People were asking about that.
Okay, so you would need to give me a screen share.
Okay, but in the meantime, I just want to say thank you to all of you for attending this presentation. We hope to see you all at our next webinar, which we are hoping to schedule for a Sunday in March or April. Stay safe, stay healthy, and good night.